Welcome, episode 5 of the Elemental Health Podcast. Welcome. This one's going to be what we're going to call an in-between episode. So there's no interviewee on this one. It's just me, a short, sharp injection of hopefully some interesting information and based on some Q&A feedback from you guys. So we just jump straight in and going to try and keep this sort of short, sweet, and nutritious. So I have a couple of different Facebook groups out there where I sort of engage with guys, coaching clients, bits and pieces, and the chat's interesting, always based around health and wellness and fitness and all things thereabouts. And obviously people are constantly posting questions. So what I've done in the early stages of this show, as we're in, is I pulled out quite an interesting question there that should lead me on to a little bit of a chat about fat loss. And kind of my view on that, because people tend to stop me and accost me when we're out and about, and I tell them I'm a health coach. They tend to ask me sort of, how do I get fit? How do I lose get in shape? I've got this bit of fat on my belly I want to lose, and you know those sort of questions always pop up, and it's always an interesting one to field, because without knowing anything about the person that stood in front of you or messaging you or whatever, it's really, really tricky as a coach to try and give them quality advice. And that's it's always worth bearing in mind. You know, what I always say is your health is your responsibility, and it's up to you to take ownership. And in this day and age, it's really easy to try and look for an external medium or an external person, tool, tactic that's gonna kind of turn up on your doorstep and solve all of your problems. And that's just simply never the case. The results come through consistency and taking ownership. And usually, not always, usually it's the simplest, most basic answers and the most basic habits that get the most results. And that can be seen not just in kind of the stuff that I do, but at sort of the really elite performer level. And whether we talk about elite sports people or elite business people, elite athletes, any sort of fighters, boxers, whatever you want to look at, fundamentally they're doing the basics very, very well. That's step one, and that's what they do consistently. They then layer on some interesting tools and tactics, but without that bedrock of foundation of the basics and the consistency in their training, that they're building on sand, and they just simply don't do it. So the best of the best just simply don't do that. But as lay people, all we see is the finished product. So it's really easy to say, well, yeah, he's got the best tool, best tactic, or he's got the best trainer for the last 6 weeks, and that's why he's the best. It's the tip of the iceberg that we see. And that therein lies the problem, because we get drawn to something where we can just see the absolute tip of the iceberg, and we don't understand the work that's gone in to create what we see, everything that's under the waterline, as they say. So, with that said, let's try and jump in and actually answer a question that popped up. It's one that does come up on a regular basis. I'm sure there's plenty of pros out there listening who've had this question over and over again in their careers. So one of the guys, he's jumped in and he said, I'm 90% happy with my body. Just need that final sculpt to be totally satisfied. Trains a decent amount every week, high intensity, resistance, clean diet, doesn't drink. On the scales, he's sort of a decent weight, I would say, for his size and height. But the last layer of belly fat stares me out every morning. I'm sure some of us can relate to that. And you know, he's kind of asking the question of how do I shift that final layer of belly fat, even though he's got potentially really healthy habits, or that's what's suggested in the post that he's left up for me to answer, and dives into the sort of the calorie count a little bit in the notes, and it kind of looks like on the surface of it that he's in a calorie deficit. With lots of movement, lots of activity. So it's tricky, because I think what happens as guys, and this is a guy, age undetermined, I think early 50s, healthy guy, been very active, ex-military, I believe, and he's potentially doing a lot of things right. Certainly seems that way, but it's that final bit of kind of, I guess in a way, aesthetics, but more importantly, kind of just feeling good and feeling like he's really achieving his goals that he's looking for an answer to. Now, the question that he's posing, really, the crux of it is, I'm in a I think I'm in a calorie deficit. I'm doing lots of activity, which suggests that I am in a calorie deficit. Why am I not losing fat anymore? And that's, that's a really tricky question to answer without speaking to this guy and kind of getting to the crux of the routine and what's going on, because on the face of it, that kind of makes sense. Input, output, very simple equation, and, the simple things do tend to work. Unfortunately, as we get older, our metabolism changes, our hormones change a lot as well. And we fundamentally need to think about things slightly differently. So a simple approach of calorie in, calorie out, activity in, activity out, and doing things that way might not give us the answers that we need in order to progress. And I think that's probably the case in this one. And it's tricky because you kind of want to get someone moving in the right direction as quickly as possible. And there are a few different approaches which I'll dive into, but these are very general approaches. And like I'm always saying, it's about finding a bespoke solution that works for you and taking ownership. And there's lots of different things that could be done and could be tested in order to shift that belly fat that this guy's desperately trying to shift. Fundamentally, though, if we step outside that for a second, the question inevitably, certainly with my guys, and it's what I'm always drilling into when I talk about mindset and health versus fitness, and that kind of conundrum is why. So we always need to understand our why. Why are we focused on shifting a little bit of belly fat? That's a symptom of something that's happening in your body, which fundamentally, if you want to think about it like this, is a symptom of something that's happening in your mind. So it's always worth just stepping away and just pondering that for a few seconds, no matter what you're doing or what you're facing in life, because that's how everything starts. So with that said, I'm going to dive straight in and kind of go into some generic tools and tricks, and well, no, they're not tricks, tools and tips that people can take away and try to try and shake things up effectively. Because if what you're doing is not working, you have to change your approach, and you might even have to change your beliefs around a certain topic or subject, or shift your beliefs, sometimes temporarily, sometimes for good, in order to get the result that you're looking for. So, how do we shift the belly fat? Well, okay, so you probably gather that I'm not a massive fan of kind of calorie counting and just looking at sort of symptoms and one plus one sort of attitude. I always like to dig a bit deeper and try and understand what's going on underneath. And I think for me, it's about understanding where the gaps are and finding the gaps and then fixing them yourself. And that's the whole ownership piece. So I think, but that said, so I think the kind of initial response would be to really analyze your diet and just ensure we are excluding sugars, dairy we can experiment with, and then we're really using sort of slow burning carbohydrates, which are by their very nature low in their glycemic index, so low sugar carbohydrates that take longer to burn, and fewer as well, depending on your body type. So if we are really clean and are removing obvious sugars and sweeteners, the manufactured stuff, we can then go a layer further and look at what other sugars and bits and pieces are in our diet that aren't as obvious to see. So we can look at, how much fruit, what kind of fruit we're eating, what kind of carbohydrates we're taking on board, and try and clean that area up in terms of sugars. We can then look at the type of carbohydrates that we're taking on board, and we can then try and clean that up so we can go for much slower burning carbohydrates. I'm a massive advocate of a plant-based approach. So it's not just about burning the fat off, but about having a nice healthy life. And we know that having a plant-based approach is going to get us the micronutrients as well as the macronutrient requirement, and have us live a much healthier life. So processed carbohydrates are not what we want, because on the whole they're very fast burning, and also they're processed, and there's all sorts of other gunk in there that you don't want to have if you're trying to clean up your diet. So sugars, carbohydrates, and then for me, I think dairy as well needs to be ripped out, because a lot of the evidence suggests that it just slows us down. Whatever we're doing, it kind of slows us down. So for me, certainly, as soon as I started getting dairy out of my diet, my body fat and certainly the aesthetics cleaned up really, really quickly. And I've seen that result in clients, and I've seen that result in lots of people that I've met as well. And we've had similar chats around sugar and dairy. So I would rip out all dairy, maybe only temporarily, because I know a lot of people kind of like and live on that stuff, but it can be very addictive. The cheeses and those bits and pieces can be very addictive and very salty. So it's a good idea to kind of pull that out and just go without it when we're trying to burn off that fat. What else? So those are three areas of the diet, sort of at a high level we can interrogate and say, right, bang, 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 bang. Let's try and strip all that stuff out, see how we get on. Believe me, if you find some answers in that area and you start to experiment with that stuff, you will see the results come through very, very quickly. Like anything, it's about being consistent and finding what works for you, and finding what works in your weekly routine as well, and fits in with your sort of habits. But I do find there's a lot of sneaky sugars and sneaky dairies that are out there, and people don't necessarily realize how much of those they're taking on board. So you really do have to put a microscope on what you're doing, and things like a food diary, food journal sounds a bit kind of naff, and people don't like writing stuff down, and they're like, oh, I'm not fat, I don't need to go and write stuff down. But you if you want results, if you want to get to where you want to get to, you need to be analytical, and you need to put yourself under a microscope. You need to hold yourself accountable. And the simplest way to do that is just write shit down, because there's nowhere to hide. Good. So we cover that sort of a high level, the diet components. I think for me, like everything, I just try and keep it really, really simple. We know we need to eat lots of greens. We know we need to eat lots of veg, and we know that that's going to promote a healthy body. So make sure we're not kind of skipping really healthy, nutritious components to our diet. So if we've really kind of cleaned that up, we can then additionally try and look at cycling the components of kind of carbohydrate, protein and fat, cycling through those to find an optimal level. And this is getting quite granular, but for a temporary period, to try and find a balance for you, it's usually a really, really good idea. Just having a slurp of coffee. So what we can do is try and pull out the percentage of carbs that we have in our diet, so reduce that down, see how our body compensates, and see how our body composition changes as well. And we can do that over a sort of 4-6 week process, just removing or lowering the carbohydrates. if you're doing everything at once, so removing sugar, removing carbs, you're going to feel pretty shitty because we get so addicted to these things. It's very, very easy to have a sugar addiction. And lots of people are out there for sure are suffering. So as soon as you start pulling this stuff out, you're going to take a bit of a dip in energy. Moods as well would be affected. So it's worth thinking about that sort of stuff. But yeah, cycling through your carbohydrate percentage ratios is definitely something that can be looked at. And again, it can be very, very, very effective. And in that process, you will find a nice balance for you. So if you try and rip out every single carbohydrate and go completely keto, the first 2 or 3 weeks is going to be hell on earth for you. And then your body will start to find some sort of equilibrium. But you can do it on a much lesser scale of that and just try and reduce it down, see how you feel, and try and find a nice balance between your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your fats. One point on proteins that I think people tend to gloss over is certainly growing up as a young guy. You're like, protein, give me the protein powder. I don't need water. I'm just going to guzzle it dry. And that kind of falls over into sort of more mature guys as well, because guys pretty much we're pretty immature in the way we think about lots and lots of things, and we tend to carry through what we think is a good idea all the way through our 20s, into our 30s, into our 40s, into our 50s. Now, one thing we do know now, and I will talk more about this in detail because proteins are a really, really interesting subject. But one thing we know is, meat proteins, or reducing meat proteins, will help us to live a longer, healthier life. And that's why the plant-based movement is growing and is gathering a lot of scientific interest, because of the longevity aspects of taking meat proteins out of your life. Now, when you're young and you want to build muscle and get strong, athletic, and grow as a mature into a mature man, you need proteins. And arguably, meat proteins are a great source of proteins for someone who's growing up and wants to be big and strong and tough. However, as soon as you get a little bit older and you're thinking about longevity and health, that equation no longer works, and you need to start thinking differently about your protein sources and the amount of protein you're taking on board. Simply put, reduce the amount of protein, reduce the amount of animal protein, and reduce the total number of calories that we consume, the healthier we will be at a very high level, 30,000 view of kind of longevity, certainly from my understanding of the research that I've done. So that's something to bear in mind when we're kind of playing with our ratios in regard to this question that's come through. So we can look at what percentage fats we got, what percentage protein we've got, and what percentage of carbohydrate. And really, as a guy moving into their 40s or 50s or older, or even a girl that's doing the same, and you're kind of in that conundrum of like, I want to be fit and strong, but I also want to have a really long and healthy, happy life. It's worth thinking, well, I want to shift my focus from loads of protein to actually healthy fats, and a really balanced, plant-based, nutritionally rich or micronutrient-rich diet. But yes, we can look at those different ratios and play with that to try and work out what's going to work well for us. Gone are the days where you're kind of pounding bowls and bowls of pasta before a rugby game, like I did. It's just not the wisest way to operate. And then getting a more granular approach again is we can go into this very popular movement now of intermittent fasting, and try and look at the periodization of our food intake or calorie intake over a 24-hour, 128-hour week. So we can look at when we take food on board, and if we have a massive window of fasting, then the benefits there, we can try and flick into a bit of a fat burning mode, and generally we can also we're restricting our calories effectively. So the body is creating a more of a kind of a demand for burning fat as well, because it's not getting the constant food intake, and it's also not getting the signals as well. That's important to focus on. It's not getting the signals for a constant food intake, which are just as important, because it's going to release all those hormones. So it's not getting those two things in, and it's been widely proven now that these can have very positive health benefits, and obviously get through fat as well. Very, very popular these days. Something that I indulge in. So I usually try and do a 24 hour fast every week, and as some of you know, I did a 5-day fast at the start of the year just to sort of kickstart 2019. And yeah, for sure, your body's going to flip over. You do an extended fast, your body's going to flip over into fat burning mode, and any sort of fat you've got will start to get chewed through. And yeah, have a look at my YouTube channel if you want a bit more details on that longer fast that I did. Took something out of me, and it certainly made me think about a few interesting components. So those are like the kind of the kind of big wins and the things to look at initially. Like I said, it's really important to understand your why, but also what's really important is understanding the stresses in your life, because fundamentally we could get everything right in terms of nutrition, when we're eating, what we're eating, the ratios of carbohydrates, the proteins, the fats. If we're stressed, if we're not rested, if we're not resting well, if we're taking too many stimulants on board, then our metabolism will be fundamentally altered, and therefore your ability to process calories and be active and burn through fat as well will be severely impaired. And that's something we see all the time as pros. So we see guys that are coming through and they say, well, I've tried this diet, and actually on the face of it they have done that, but they're not getting any results. And you really need to switch fire and look at the stresses in your life and start to understand what's going on there. And because on a physiological level, never mind an emotional, psychological level, on a physiological level, if we're getting big stresses in our lives that we're not dealing with, we're constantly in a sort of fight or flight mode, and there's a lot of adrenal response, and our adrenal glands get sort of burnt out. Our cortisol, stress hormones are really, really high all the time, and we're constantly in this kind of state of fear, and digestion is very poor, and there's a whole wealth of things that happen or don't happen because you're in this constant state of stress on your body. So make no mistake, stress kills, the biggest killer out there, and that's what you need to be looking at, as well as everything else that we talk about. And that's the crux of what needs to happen, really, is to understand your stressors, and that's always where you need to start. Because that'll lead to the why of what you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing, really, in terms of health and fitness and everything else in your life. So don't underestimate how much impact stress, whether you're aware of the stress or not, is having on your health, and your ability to burn fat, to process food, and to just be healthy. So just a sober thought to ponder on there. Whilst we wrap up this solo podcast. It's been interesting. Stood here on my own, no one to talk to, just trying to freestyle it. As usual, guys, I'm not trying to read through a script of information to give you. I'm just kind of freeballing to try and give you an idea of things to think about, and I'll try and make everything as simple as possible, because I don't want to dive into the details of the scientific components, because what I tend to find is people kind of glaze over, switch off, and don't take that stuff in. So I inherently try and link it to a story, or link it to a point of reference that's meaningful for people out there, and not get bogged down in kind of X and Y, because ultimately you will always find, if you go digging, you will find examples and evidence for both sides of the fence, usually, and then it kind of becomes a situation of, well, which one do I choose? And usually we decide, especially as lay people, we decide to do neither. So we sit on the fence and we're indecisive and we don't take action. which is, in my opinion, fundamentally the absolutely wrong thing to do. We need to take massive action in order to transform ourselves, to make change. And that's why we need to keep it simple, be consistent, and keep moving in the right direction. See you on the next one.